The grandfather clock in the entrance hall had not chimed correctly in months. It struck 13 at noon, 7 at midnight, and sometimes not at all, as if time itself had grown tired of keeping accurate records in the Burton household. Ella thought it was rather appropriate. After all, her own internal workings had been declared defunct years ago, so why should the clock be any different? The entire estate smelled of old pipe smoke and furniture polish applied too liberally to hide the scent of wood rot beneath. The creditors had stopped coming to the front door 3 weeks ago. Now they simply sent letters, each one more tersely worded than the last, stacked in neat piles on her father's desk, like a paper wall closing in. Ella stood in the drawing-room, watching her father arrange papers on the mahogany side table with the precision of a man preparing evidence for trial. Nicholas Burton had always been meticulous. Even now, with his cravat slightly askew and his morning coat showing its age at the elbows, he moved with deliberate care. He was staging the room, she realized, setting the scene for a buyer's inspection. The afternoon light filtered through unwashed windows, turning everything the color of old tea. Outside, a carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest waited in the drive, its silver wolf emblem catching what little sun managed to penetrate the autumn gloom. The horses stamped their feet. They had been waiting for 20 minutes while her father made his final preparations. On the table before him lay a leather portfolio, its contents neatly organized. Property deeds, the Burton family tree going back 7 generations, and there, placed prominently on top like the certificate for a prize mare, a medical document sealed with Dr. Whitmore's wax stamp. Certificate of Permanent Reproductive Incapacity. The words were printed in elegant script across the top. Ella had seen it only once before, when her mother had wept over it in her bedroom 3 years ago, then locked it away as if hiding evidence of a crime. Her father lifted the certificate now, holding it up to the light as if verifying its authenticity one final time, then placed it back with the other documents. He checked his pocket watch. Exactly 3 o'clock. The Duke of Ravenwood was a punctual man, it seemed. That spoke to character, her father had said, to reliability. "You're hovering, Ella." Nicholas Burton did not turn from his work. "It suggests uncertainty. The Duke values certainty above all things." "I am uncertain," she replied, her voice carrying none of the tremor she'd expected. Perhaps she had used up all her trembling the night her parents had explained the arrangement, when her mother had gripped her hands and said, "We are doing this for you, darling. A duchess, can you imagine?" As if the title were the point. As if they all knew she was being sold because she was unsellable anywhere else. Her father finally looked at her. His eyes swept over her appearance with the assessing gaze of an auctioneer. The dress was new, purchased on credit they didn't have, pale blue silk that had been fashionable 2 seasons ago, altered to fit her frame. Her hair had been arranged by her mother's lady's maid into an elaborate style that made her look older, more sophisticated, more expensive. "The riding accident," Ella said quietly, "when I was 15. Do you remember it?" Her father returned to his documents, squaring the edges of the stack with both hands. "I remember what he told us afterward, that your injuries were extensive, internal, that you would never bear children." He paused, then added with clinical precision, "I also remember thinking at the time that it would limit your prospects considerably." Limit. Such a gentle word for what it had actually done. She had spent 3 months in bed, burning with fever. Her mother sat with her for the first week, then gradually stopped coming. By the end, only the servants attended her, and she had overheard them whispering outside her door. "Damaged goods. Poor thing. What will they do with her?" What they would do, apparently, was wait 4 years until they found someone who saw her barrenness as an asset rather than a flaw. "He's here." Her father straightened his waistcoat, then moved to the sideboard and poured himself exactly 1 finger of brandy. Dutch courage, Ella thought, though she wasn't sure if it was for him or for her. "Remember what we discussed. You will be gracious, you will be demure. You will not ask questions about his motives or his household. Those are not your concern." "What is my concern?" "Being useful." He downed the brandy in one swallow. "The Duke of Ravenwood has no use for a woman who can give him children. He has very specific reasons for requiring the opposite. You will provide him with a wife who poses no threat to his estate plans. In return, you will want for nothing." "Except a choice," she thought. "Except dignity. Except the fiction that I am anything more than a solution to two men's problems." The sound of boots in the entrance hall, heavy, confident footsteps that echoed on marble. The butler's murmured greeting. Then the drawing-room door opened, and Sebastian Garner, Duke of Ravenwood, entered like a winter wind. He was not what she expected. The rumors had painted him as cold, reclusive, possibly mad. But the man who stood in her father's drawing-room was simply tired. His dark hair was swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the tension around his eyes, the set of his jaw that suggested a man who had learned to trust no one. He looked at her father first, then finally his gaze moved to Ella. She saw it happen, the assessment, the calculation. He was measuring her the same way her father had, but with different metrics. Not her beauty or her bearing, but something else. Her capacity for discretion, perhaps, her willingness to disappear into the role he needed her to play. "Miss Burton," his voice was low, carefully neutral. "Your Grace," she curtsied, the movement automatic. Nicholas Burton stepped forward, all business now. "Your Grace, welcome. I trust the journey from Ravenwood was not too arduous." It was sufficiently brief. The Duke's eyes hadn't left Ella. "I prefer to conduct my affairs with efficiency." Affairs. The word hung in the air like smoke. Her father moved to the table, his hand hovering over the leather portfolio. "I have prepared all the necessary documentation. The settlement terms we discussed are here, along with—" He paused, then lifted the medical certificate. "Verification of the specific circumstances that make this arrangement mutually beneficial." Sebastian Garner took the document. He did not read it. Instead, he folded it once precisely and tucked it into his inside coat pocket. "I do not require verification, Mr. Burton. I require certainty." His gaze returned to Ella. "And I believe we understand each other's certainties quite well." Nicholas Burton's smile was the smile of a man who had just closed a profitable sale. "Indeed, Your Grace, indeed." The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. He set it on the table with a soft clink of metal against wood. Gold, Ella realized, enough to settle her father's debts, enough to buy a daughter's future, enough to purchase a barren girl and call it a marriage. "Miss Burton," the Duke said, his tone unchanged, "my carriage is waiting. I trust you are prepared to depart." It was not a question. Nothing about this had been a question. Ella looked at her father, who was already reaching for the gold pouch, weighing it in his palm with the satisfied expression of a man whose problems had just solved themselves. She looked at the certificate, now hidden in the Duke's coat pocket, her broken body reduced to a transaction receipt. She looked at the door, and at the carriage beyond it, and at the silver wolf emblem that would now be hers to bear. "I am prepared," she said, and as Nicholas Burton counted coins that would never fill the hole in his accounts for long, Ella Burton walked out of her father's house on the arm of a stranger, sold not despite her barrenness, but because of it. The grandfather clock struck 4 times, though it was only 3:30. Even time itself, it seemed, had stopped keeping honest count of what was lost. My lovely family, before we continue with this story, please tell us where you're watching from. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel so that you do not miss stories like this one. The carriage door closed with a sound like a coffin lid. Ella sat on the velvet bench, her hands folded in her lap, and watched through the window as her father's house grew smaller. He had not come out to see her off, neither had her mother. The only witness to her departure was the housekeeper, Mrs. Davidson, who had pressed a handkerchief into Ella's palm and whispered, "God keep you, miss." The Duke of Ravenwood sat across from her, his long legs angled to avoid touching hers in the confined space. He had not spoken since handing her into the carriage, had not looked at her directly. His gaze remained fixed on the passing countryside, his expression as shuttered as the windows of an abandoned house. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Ella counted the seconds at first, then the minutes. By the time they reached the main road, she had stopped counting altogether. The Duke seemed to exist in a state of perfect stillness, his hands resting on his knees, his breathing so measured she wondered if he had trained himself to take up as little space as possible. The road wound through fields gone brown with autumn. Farmhouses dotted the landscape, their chimneys trailing smoke into a sky the colour of tarnished silver. Ella watched a woman hanging laundry in a dooryard, her children playing at her feet, and felt something twist in her chest. "You may speak, if you wish," the Duke said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. Ella turned from the window. "I was not certain if conversation was permitted. It is not forbidden." His eyes remained on the landscape. "I simply find it rarely serves any useful purpose." How pragmatic! "Pragmatism has kept me alive, Miss Burton. Sentiment has buried most of my family." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ella thought of the rumours she had heard, the Duke's 2 younger brothers, both dead before their 30th birthdays. "My condolences," she said quietly. "Don't," the word was sharp, "do not offer sympathy for things you know nothing about." Ella folded her hands more tightly. "I apologize." "And do not apologize when you have done nothing wrong." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were the colour of winter storms. "We will be living in the same house, Miss Bletton. We may as well establish the terms of our arrangement now. You will not be required to pretend affection you do not feel. You will not be expected to play the doting wife for society's benefit. In return, I will not ask questions about what you do with your time, so long as you remain discreet." "And what will I be expected to do?" "Exist, be present at necessary functions, sign documents when required." His gaze moved back to the window. "And ensure that my estate passes to the charitable trust I have established, rather than to the vultures who call themselves my cousins." "Because a wife who cannot produce an heir poses no threat to anyone." "Precisely." Ella felt the words like a slap, though his tone had not changed. She had known this was the arrangement, had understood it from the moment her father first explained the Duke's unusual requirements, but hearing it stated so boldly made her feel like something being catalogued in a ledger. "And if I had wanted children, if I had not been damaged," the Duke's jaw tightened, "then this conversation would not be taking place. You would have been married off to some squire's son who needed a womb more than a mind. Consider yourself fortunate, Miss Burton. At least I have no illusions about what you can provide." Fortunate, yes, how fortunate I am. They fell back into silence, but it was different now, heavier, weighted with all the things neither of them could say. The carriage rattled over a stone bridge, and Ella caught a glimpse of dark water below, churning with autumn rain. The landscape began to change. The fields gave way to dense woods, the trees pressing close to the road like sentinels. The light filtering through the canopy turned everything green and shadowed, and the temperature in the carriage dropped noticeably. Ella pulled her cloak more tightly around her shoulders. "We are on Ravenwood land now," the Duke said. "It extends for 30 miles in every direction. You will find it isolated." "Will I be a prisoner, then?" "You will be a duchess. There is often little difference." The carriage rounded a final bend, and through the trees Ella caught her first glimpse of Ravenwood Manor. It rose from the forest like something carved from shadow itself, all dark stone and Gothic arches, its windows reflecting the dying light like dozens of watching eyes. Ivy climbed the walls in thick, choking vines. It looked exactly like the kind of place where a man would bring a wife he never intended to love. The carriage pulled to a stop before the main entrance. The Duke stepped out first, not offering her his hand. Ella descended on her own, her boots touching gravel that crunched beneath her weight. A butler stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Welcome to Ravenwood, Your Grace," he said. The Duke brushed past her, ascending the steps without a backward glance. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your rooms. Dinner is at 8. Do not be late." Then he was gone, disappeared into the dark mouth of the manor, leaving Ella alone in the courtyard, with nothing but her small trunk and the weight of her new title pressing down on her shoulders like a stone. Mrs. Hartwell was a woman carved from granite and disapproval. She led Ella through corridors that smelled of beeswax and something older, deeper, the scent of a house that had seen too many secrets buried within its walls. The housekeeper's keys jangled at her waist with each step, a sound like tiny bells tolling for the dead. "Your rooms, Miss Burton," Mrs. Hartwell said, pushing open a heavy oak door. She did not say, "Your Grace." Ella noticed the omission. The suite was larger than her entire bedroom at home, decorated in shades of burgundy and gold that might have been fashionable 30 years ago. Everything was immaculate, untouched, waiting. "Dinner is at 8, Mrs. Hartwell repeated. "His Grace expects punctuality. After dinner you will be summoned to the library. His Grace has arrangements to finalize." The word hung in the air like a noose. Arrangements. Dinner was a silent affair conducted in a dining room set for 2. The Duke sat at the head of the table, Ella at the foot, an expanse of polished mahogany stretching between them. Servants moved like ghosts, placing course after course. The Duke ate methodically, his attention fixed on his plate. He did not attempt conversation. When the final course was cleared, he stood, folding his napkin with precise movements. "The library," he said. "Follow me." The library was a cathedral of books, 3 stories of volumes climbing toward a domed ceiling painted with constellations. A fire burned in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows. In the center of the room stood a long table, and on it, arranged with meticulous care, lay a series of documents. A man Ella did not recognize stood beside the table, elderly, dressed in black, his face deeply lined. A solicitor, she realized, or perhaps a priest. "Miss Burton," the Duke said, gesturing to the table, "Mr. Pemberton has prepared the necessary documents." Ella approached slowly. The papers were thick parchment, covered in dense legal text. She could make out certain phrases: lawful union, irrevocable contract, terms and conditions. "This is our wedding?" she asked. "This is the formalization of our arrangement," the Duke corrected. He moved to the opposite side of the table. "The ceremony itself will be brief. Mr. Pemberton is authorized to officiate. No witnesses are required beyond his signature and ours. No family, no guests. Would you prefer your father to be here, to watch as his investment is secured?" Ella lifted her chin. "No." "Then we are in agreement." The Duke nodded to Mr. Pemberton. "Proceed." The old man cleared his throat, opening a small leather-bound book. His voice was dry, perfunctory. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and the law to join Sebastian James Garner, Duke of Ravenwood, and Ella Margaret Burton in holy matrimony." Holy, the word felt obscene in this context. "The law requires certain vows. His Grace has indicated a preference for brevity." "How efficient," Ella murmured. The Duke's eyes flickered to her face. "Do you have an objection, Miss Burton?" "Would it matter if I did?" "No." At least he was honest. Mr. Pemberton shuffled his papers. "Your Grace, if you would repeat after me. I, Sebastian James Garner, take thee, Ella Margaret Burton." The Duke's voice was flat, mechanical. I, Sebastian James Garner, take thee, Ella Margaret Burton, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for as long as we both shall live. The traditional phrases felt wrong in his mouth, to have and to hold, but he did not want to hold her. Till death do us part. Death, at least, seemed a certainty in this house. Miss Burton, Mr. Pemberton prompted, your vows. Ella looked at the Duke, at the sharp angles of his face thrown into relief by firelight, at the absolute absence of anything resembling warmth. She thought of her father's drawing-room, of the medical certificate, of the gold that had changed hands. She thought of having nowhere else to go. I, Ella Margaret Burton, she said, her voice steady, take thee, Sebastian James Garner, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for as long as we both shall live. The lie tasted like ashes. The rings, Mr. Pemberton said. The Duke produced a small velvet box. Inside lay 2 bands of gold, both plain, both cold. He took one, reaching for Ella's hand. His fingers were ice against her skin. He slid the ring onto her finger with mechanical precision, then held out his own hand. Ella's fingers trembled as she took the second ring. The gold was heavy in her palm. She slid it onto the Duke's finger, feeling the calluses there, evidence of some life beyond these transactions. By the power vested in me, Mr. Pemberton intoned, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He did not say what came next, did not tell the Duke to kiss his bride. That mercy, at least, was granted. The documents, the Duke said immediately. Mr. Pemberton produced a quill and inkwell. Your Grace, if you would sign here, and here. The Duke signed each paper with swift strokes. His signature was bold, illegible, the mark of a man accustomed to authority. Your Grace, Mr. Pemberton said, nodding to Ella. She took the quill. Her hand hovered over the first document. Contract of marriage between Sebastian James Garner and Ella Margaret Burton. Below it, in smaller text, terms of inheritance, property rights, and dissolution. Dissolution! They had planned for the end before the beginning had even started. Ella signed, then signed again and again. Each stroke felt like carving her name into her own tombstone. It is done, Mr. Pemberton said quietly. May I offer my congratulations to your Graces. The title sounded wrong attached to Ella. The Duke nodded dismissively. You may retire, Pemberton. Your discretion is appreciated. The solicitor withdrew, leaving them alone. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed midnight. The Duke moved to the sideboard and poured himself brandy. He did not offer one to Ella. You are now the Duchess of Ravenwood, he said, his back to her. Your rooms are yours. Your time is yours. I will not impose upon either unless circumstances require it. How generous! It is the agreement. The agreement, Ella repeated. She looked down at the gold band on her finger. It caught the firelight, glinting like a shackle. And what if I want more than an agreement? The Duke turned slowly. His expression was unreadable. Then I would remind you, Your Grace, that wanting and having are 2 very different things. He drained his brandy, set the glass down with a sharp click, and walked toward the door. Welcome to your new life, he said, without looking back. I trust you will find it sufficiently empty. Then he was gone, and Ella stood alone in the library, a duchess in name, a prisoner in fact, married to a man who had just walked away from his own wedding night without a backward glance. Ella woke to silence so profound it felt like drowning. No bird song filtered through the heavy curtains, no servants moved in the hallway beyond her door. Ravenwood Manor, it seemed, was a house that held its breath. She dressed herself, fumbling with buttons meant for a lady's maid she had not yet met and was not certain she wanted. The mirror showed a stranger in pale morning light, a woman wearing borrowed finery and a gold ring that felt like a brand. The Duchess of Ravenwood looked exactly like Ella Burton, only more tired. The corridors were a maze of shadows and closed doors. She descended a staircase she thought led to the main hall, but found herself instead in a gallery lined with portraits. Generations of Garners stared down at her with the same winter storm eyes the Duke possessed. She counted 3 young men in the most recent paintings, all bearing a family resemblance. The Duke's brothers, she realized, both dead before 30. She turned away from their frozen gazes and found a door that opened onto the eastern grounds. The gardens hit her like a physical blow. They stretched before her in what must have once been magnificent splendor, rows of boxwood hedges, stone pathways winding between flower beds, a fountain at the center depicting wolves in bronze. But everything was dying. The hedges were brown at their bases, their leaves spotted with decay. The flower beds held only withered stems. Even the grass beneath her feet crunched like paper, yellow and brittle despite the autumn damp. Ella moved deeper into the garden, her trained eye cataloguing the destruction. She had spent years studying botanical medicine with her mother's physician after the accident, when books had been her only companions. She knew what healthy plants looked like. This was something else entirely. She knelt beside a rosebush, its branches bare and blackened. The soil around its base felt wrong, gritty, almost oily to the touch. She brought her fingers to her nose and caught a scent that didn't belong, bitter, chemical. The Duchess has discovered our shame. Ella spun. A man stood on the path behind her, tall and weathered, wearing work clothes that'd seen better decades. His face was deeply lined, his hair more silver than dark. The groundskeeper, she assumed. "Your shame?" she asked, rising to her feet. "Ravenwood's shame." He gestured at the desolation surrounding them. These gardens were the Duke's pride once, his mother's before him. Now look at them. 3 years of dying, and no one can determine why. 3 years, Ella repeated, the same length of time since the Duke's youngest brother had died. What changed 3 years ago? The groundskeeper's expression darkened. "Everything, Your Grace. The young master passed, the Duke shot himself away, and the gardens began to fail, one section at a time. Some say it's the land mourning, some say it's a curse. And what do you say?" "I say, Your Grace, that land doesn't mourn, and curses don't kill plants this methodically." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "I've been at Ravenwood 40 years. I know every inch of this soil. This isn't neglect. This is something deliberate." Ella's pulse quickened. "Poison? I've thought it, but who would I tell? The Duke doesn't come to the gardens anymore. Mrs. Hartwell says I'm imagining things, and the cousins—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. "The cousins," Ella prompted. "The Duke's cousins visit often, Your Grace. They take great interest in the estate's affairs, particularly in documenting its decline." The groundskeeper met Ella's eyes. "A failing estate becomes a financial burden. Financial burdens must be sold, and buyers are often family who know the true value." The implication hung heavy in the air. The Duke's cousins, waiting for him to die without heirs, slowly destroying the estate to force its sale. "What's your name?" Ella asked. "Thomas, Your Grace. Thomas Blackwood." "Thomas, I need you to show me every section of the garden. I need to see where the damage began and how it spread." Something flickered across his weathered face, hope, perhaps, or simply relief that someone was finally asking questions. "This way, Your Grace." They walked the grounds for 2 hours. Thomas showed her the prize-winning orchards that had once supplied fruit to the royal household, now barren and twisted, the herb gardens that had provided medicinal plants for the village, reduced to ash-coloured stalks, the greenhouse where exotic specimens had flourished, now a cemetery of shattered glass and dead vines. At each site, Ella examined the soil, the roots, the pattern of decay, and at each site she found the same gritty residue, the same bitter scent, barely masked by earth and rain. Arsenic compounds, she said finally, kneeling beside what had been a bed of lavender, mixed with something else, copper sulfate perhaps, applied consistently over time in small enough doses to seem like natural blight. Thomas stared at her. "You can tell all that from touching the dirt. My mother's physician taught me botanical medicine. I learned to identify toxins by their effects." Ella straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "This is deliberate poisoning, Thomas. Someone with access to these gardens has been systematically destroying them. But who would—" Thomas stopped as voices drifted from the house. Ella turned. 3 figures emerged onto the terrace. 2 men and a woman, all expensively dressed, all bearing a resemblance to the Duke. They moved with the casual entitlement of people who considered themselves owners in waiting. "The cousins," Thomas muttered. "Mr. Richard, Mr. Edmund, and Lady Catherine. They arrived this morning, Your Grace. Mrs. Hartwell said they've come to meet the new Duchess." Ella watched them descend the terrace steps, their gazes sweeping over the ruined gardens, with expressions that might have been sympathy, but looked more like satisfaction. The woman, Catherine, held a handkerchief to her nose, as if the dead plants offended her delicate sensibilities. "How tragic," Catherine called out, her voice carrying across the garden. "To think this was once the jewel of the county. Poor Sebastian must be devastated. Though perhaps," the older man, Richard, added smoothly, "it's a blessing he has no children to inherit such decay." Edmund, the younger, laughed. Indeed, what child would want this crumbling pile? They had not yet noticed Ella standing among the ruins, her dress dirt-stained, her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked, she realized, like a servant or a ghost. She stepped onto the path. "Gentlemen, Lady Catherine," her voice carried the authority she had heard in her mother's tone when dealing with presumptuous callers. "I am Eva Garner, Duchess of Ravenwood, and I assure you this estate is far from a crumbling pile." The cousins froze. Catherine's handkerchief lowered slowly from her face. Richard's smile became fixed, artificial. "Your Grace," Richard recovered first, executing a bow that was precisely correct and entirely insincere. "We had no idea you were exploring. I am inspecting my property, and I have discovered something rather interesting." I held up my soil-stained fingers. "These gardens are not dying of neglect or natural causes. They are being murdered, slowly, methodically, and with considerable chemical knowledge." The silence that followed was absolute. Edmund's face had gone pale. Catherine clutched her handkerchief tighter. Richard's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes had hardened to flint. "What an extraordinary accusation," Richard said softly. "I hope you have evidence to support such a claim." "I have soil samples. I have patterns of decay that follow human traffic rather than natural spread. And I have 3 years of systematic destruction that began precisely when someone stood to gain from Ravenwood's failure." Ella met his gaze. "I intend to present my findings to the Duke." "The Duke," Catherine said, her voice sharp, "is not interested in gardens. He has far more pressing concerns." "Then perhaps it's fortunate he now has a Duchess who is interested." Ella turned to Thomas. "Mr. Blackwood, please prepare samples from each affected area. I'll need them for analysis." "Yes, Your Grace." Ella walked past the cousins, close enough to see the calculation in their eyes, the reassessment of what they had thought would be a controllable variable in their plans. The Barren Duchess, who was supposed to be decorative and silent, had now become something else entirely. She climbed the terrace steps and paused at the door, looking back at the ruined gardens and the people who had destroyed them. "Ravenwood will bloom again," she said. "I suggest you reconcile yourselves to that fact." Then she entered the house, leaving them standing among the evidence of their crime, and went to find her husband. She found him in his study, a room she had not yet seen, tucked into the north wing where the sunlight never reached. He sat behind a massive desk covered in ledgers and correspondence, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his cravat discarded. He looked up as she entered, and something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or annoyance. "Your Grace," he said, the title sounding wrong in his mouth. "I was not aware we had scheduled an audience." "We hadn't." Ella closed the door behind her. "Your gardens are being poisoned. Arsenic compounds mixed with copper sulfate, applied systematically over 3 years. Your cousins are responsible." The Duke's expression did not change. He set down his pen with careful precision. "You have been at Ravenwood less than a day, and you have already diagnosed agricultural blight and identified culprits. How efficient!" "Mock me if you wish. The evidence is there for anyone with eyes to see it." "I have eyes, Your Grace. I have chosen not to look." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the eastern grounds. From this vantage, the full scope of the destruction was visible. "The gardens began dying 3 years ago, the same month my youngest brother, William, died of a sudden fever, a fever that came on him after dinner with our cousins." Ella's breath caught. "You knew?" "I suspected. Suspicion and proof are different things, and proof, even if obtained, would require me to accuse my own blood of fratricide in open court." His jaw tightened. "The scandal would destroy what remains of the Garner name." "So you simply let them continue? Let them poison your land, your legacy?" "My legacy was already poisoned, Your Grace, long before the gardens started dying." He turned from the window, and his eyes held something Ella had not seen before: exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had been fighting alone for too long. "My brother Charles died 4 years ago in a riding accident. His saddle girth had been cut nearly through, enough to fail under strain, but not enough to be noticed during inspection. William died the year after, and I—" He stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. "I have survived 3 attempts on my life in the past 18 months. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ella felt the weight of them settling over her shoulders. The wine at dinner that made me violently ill, the carriage wheel that came loose on the London road, the fire in my chambers that the servants attributed to a fallen candle." His voice was flat, emotionless, reciting facts. "My cousins are patient, methodical. They have been systematically eliminating the Garner line, waiting for me to die without issue, so the duchy passes to Richard as the eldest male heir." "And you chose me," Ella said slowly, understanding crystallizing. "A wife who can bear no children removes their motive for killing you." "Precisely. An heir would simply become their next target. A wife who can produce no heir makes me worthless to murder. The duchy will pass to my charitable trust as I have legally arranged, and they gain nothing from my death." He met her eyes. "You were my insurance policy, Your Grace, a human shield, nothing more." The brutal honesty should have hurt. Instead, Ella felt something else entirely: clarity.
"They're destroying the gardens to force you to sell," she said, "to create a financial crisis that would require liquidating assets they could purchase at a fraction of their value."
"I am aware."
"And you've done nothing." "What would you have me do?" The Duke's voice hardened. "Accuse them based on soil samples and suspicion. They are nobility, Your Grace, connected to half the peerage. I am a reclusive duke with a reputation for madness, married to a barren woman in a midnight ceremony with no witnesses. Who do you think society would believe?" Ella moved closer, her dirt-stained hand gripping the edge of his desk. "Then we create proof they cannot dismiss. We document the poisoning. We trace the purchases of arsenic and copper sulfate. We build a case so thoroughly that even their connections cannot save them." "We," the Duke's eyebrow arched. "This is not your battle, Your Grace. I am the Duchess of Ravenwood. Your battles are mine now, whether you intended them to be or not." She straightened. "You chose me a shield, Your Grace, but shields can also be weapons." For a long moment he simply stared at her, then something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps recognition. "You should not have been dragged into this," he said quietly. "You were meant to be kept safe, separate from the darkness of this house." "I have been separate my entire life, separate from my family after my accident, separate from society, separate from any future worth having." Ella's voice steadied. "I offered you a title in exchange for my barrenness. I am offering you something more valuable, an ally who has nothing left to lose." The Duke was silent for a long moment. Outside, the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the ruined gardens. "Very well, Your Grace," he said finally. "If you insist on making yourself a target, I suppose I should at least ensure you understand what you're facing." He opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a leather journal. "These are my records, every suspicious incident, every near miss, every conversation that felt like a threat disguised as concern. If we are to build your case, you should know exactly who we're fighting." Ella took the journal. Its weight felt like a promise. "Then let us begin," she said. Ella spent 3 days in the ruined gardens with Thomas Blackwood and a makeshift laboratory she had commandeered from the estate's abandoned still room. The Duke had watched her go that first morning with an expression she could not decipher, then retreated to his study. He did not ask what she was doing, did not offer assistance. But she noticed that fresh supplies appeared outside the still-room door each evening: glass vials, distilled water, clean muslin for filtering, a microscope that must have cost a small fortune. He was watching, even if he pretended not to care. The work was meticulous, painstaking. Ella collected soil from 40 different locations across the grounds, cataloguing each sample by date and proximity to the house. She boiled portions in distilled water, filtered the residue, tested the compounds using reagents she mixed herself from the estate's surprisingly well-stocked pharmacy. Some medieval Ghana ancestor had clearly shared her interest in chemistry. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in silver solution. The poison was concentrated in areas closest to the main paths, places where any member of the household might walk unremarked. The damage radiated outward from these points in careful circles, designed to look like spreading blight rather than deliberate application. But it was the orchards that revealed the full scope of the crime. The Ravenwood orchards had once been legendary. Thomas told her stories as they worked, his voice rough with memory. The Duke's mother had developed a hybrid apple that could survive harsh winters and still produce fruit sweet enough for the royal table. The trees had been her pride, her legacy. The profits from their harvest had funded improvements to tenant farms, repairs to the village church, scholarships for promising children. Now the trees were skeletal, their branches black with rot, their roots poisoned beyond redemption. 30 years of breeding, Thomas said quietly, standing among the dead trees. Gone in 3. Ella knelt beside the largest tree, its trunk split and weeping dark sap. She scraped a sample from the exposed wood, catching the viscous liquid in a glass vial. Back in the still room, she analyzed it with shaking hands. The concentration of arsenic here was 3 times higher than anywhere else in the gardens. "They wanted to break him," she murmured, staring at the results. "Killing him would transfer the estate to trust, but breaking him first, destroying everything he valued, making him desperate enough to sell, that would give them what they wanted." She worked through the night, formulating a solution. Arsenic could be neutralized, its compounds broken down. Sulfur might bind to the metals, render them inert. Lime would raise the soil's pH, making the environment hostile to the poison's persistence. It was possible. Difficult, expensive, but possible. At dawn, she found the Duke in the breakfast room, staring at a plate of food he had not touched. "The orchards can be saved," she said without preamble. He looked up slowly. "The orchards have been dead for 2 years. The trees are dead. The soil can be remediated." She placed her notes on the table before him, pages covered in chemical formulas and calculations. "The arsenic concentration is high, but not irreversible. We treat the soil with sulfur and lime, let it rest through winter, and by spring it will be viable for new plantings." The Duke stared at the notes. New plantings would take years to produce fruit. 5 years for apples, 3 for smaller fruits. Your mother's hybrid strain, did she keep seeds, grafting samples? In the greenhouse, preserved specimens in wax, labeled in her hand. His voice had gone quiet. "I could not bring myself to destroy them." "Then we have everything we need." Ella sat across from him. "We save the soil, we plant her trees again, and we document every step so thoroughly that no court in England could deny what was done here." The Duke's fingers traced the edge of her notes, following the careful lines of her equations. When he looked up, his eyes held something she had not seen before. Not warmth precisely, but something close to it. Recognition, perhaps, or respect.
"You spent 3 days in a poisoned garden to save trees that are already dead," he said slowly. "I spent 3 days saving your mother's legacy. There is a difference." "Why?" The question was almost vulnerable. "You gain nothing from this. The orchards produce no income. The gardens are mere decoration. You could have remained in your rooms, safe and separate, as I intended." Ella met his gaze. "You chose me because I was broken, because my inability to bear children made me useful to your survival. But brokenness, Your Grace, does not equal uselessness. I may not be able to give you heirs, but I can give you this." She pushed the final page toward him. It was a detailed accounting of costs: sulfur, lime, labor, new rootstock. The sum was considerable, but not devastating. "If we begin this week, we can treat half the orchards before the first frost. The rest will wait until spring. By this time next year, Ravenwood will be producing again, and your cousins will know that their poison has failed." The Duke read the numbers twice. Then he stood, walking to the window that overlooked the eastern grounds. The morning light caught his profile, softening the harsh lines of exhaustion. "My mother used to walk those gardens every morning," he said quietly. "She would inspect each tree personally, speaking to them as if they were children. My brothers and I thought she was mad." He paused. Perhaps she simply understood that legacy is not only carried in blood. He turned, and for the first time since Ella had entered his life, he looked at her as if she were a person rather than a transaction. "Very well, Your Grace. Save my mother's trees, and send the bill to my accounts." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Ella." It was the first time he had used her name. "Your Grace?" "Thank you." The words were stiff, unpracticed, as if he had forgotten how to offer gratitude. "For seeing what I could not bear to look at." Then he was gone, leaving Ella alone with her calculations and the first fragile thread of something that might, in time, resemble partnership. She looked out at the ruined gardens and allowed herself a small smile. Let the cousins come. Let them see what a barren Duchess could grow from poisoned ground. The transformation began in inches, not miles. Sebastian, she had begun thinking of him as Sebastian rather than the Duke sometime during the second week, started appearing in the gardens while she worked. At first he simply watched from the terrace, a silent figure in dark clothes observing her consultations with Thomas. Then one morning he descended the steps and asked a question about soil drainage. By the third week he was working beside her.
It started with the account books. The orchard restoration required funds, and Sebastian insisted on reviewing every expenditure personally. They spread the ledgers across the library table, and Ella discovered he had a mind for numbers that matched her aptitude for chemistry. Where she saw compounds and reactions, he saw patterns and inefficiencies. Together they found waste the estate had carried for years, overpayment to suppliers, redundant positions, investments that had quietly hemorrhaged money. "Your steward has been embezzling," Ella said one evening, her finger tracing a series of inflated invoices. Sebastian leaned over her shoulder to examine the entries, close enough that she could smell leather and ink on his skin. "For how long?" 3 years, since your brother William died." She met his eyes. "Let me guess, the steward is related to your cousins." "Second cousin on Richard's side." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "They have been more thorough than I realized." They dismissed the steward the next morning. Sebastian conducted the interview with cold precision, while Ella stood beside him, a silent presence that spoke of unified authority. The man left Ravenwood within the hour, and Sebastian hired a new steward from London, a man whose references Ella verified personally. The evenings became theirs. After dinner, instead of retreating to separate wings, they found themselves drawn to the library. Sebastian would pour 2 glasses of brandy now, not one, and they would discuss the day's progress. The conversations grew longer, more personal. He told her about his mother's passion for botany, how she had taught him to identify plants by their Latin names before he could properly read English. Ella told him about the months after her accident, the fever dreams where she had imagined her body knitting itself back together through sheer will. "I used to think I was being punished," she admitted one night, the brandy loosening her tongue, "that God had taken my future because I had done something to deserve it." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. "And now?" "Now I think perhaps it was not a punishment. Perhaps it was preparation." She looked at him across the space between their chairs. "If I had been whole, some country squire would have married me for breeding purposes. I would have spent my life producing heirs and managing a household, never knowing I had a mind capable of more."
"You would have been wasted," Sebastian said, and the intensity in his voice startled her. "As you would have been murdered," she replied softly, "if you had married someone who could give you children. Perhaps we were both saved, then, by our respective tragedies." The acknowledgement hung between them, fragile and profound. They began taking walks through the recovering gardens, watching as the treated soil slowly released its poison. New shoots appeared where Thomas had planted winter-hardy herbs. The air smelled less of decay and more of earth preparing for renewal. Sebastian walked close enough that their hands occasionally brushed, and neither of them pulled away. One afternoon, reviewing crop rotation schedules, their heads bent over the same document, Ella felt Sebastian's hand cover hers on the page, not pulling away, not moving forward, simply resting there. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she could not name. Want, perhaps, or fear, or both. "This was not supposed to happen," he said quietly. "What wasn't?" "This." His thumb traced a small circle on her wrist. "I married you to keep you at a distance, to keep everyone at a distance. And now I find distance unbearable." Ella's breath caught. The library felt suddenly small, the space between them charged with everything they had not said. She should pull away, should remind him of their agreement, their contract, their carefully constructed boundaries. Instead, she turned her hand beneath his, threading their fingers together. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we should renegotiate our terms." Sebastian's other hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle despite the calluses. "I have nothing to offer you but a house full of ghosts and enemies who want me dead." "And I have nothing to offer you but barren ground," Ella smiled, small and sad, "but we have made something grow there regardless." He kissed her then, soft and questioning, as if asking permission for something that had already begun.
Ella answered by pulling him closer, and the contract between them dissolved into something far more dangerous, something real.
The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a lawyer in a carriage that bore no crest. Mrs. Hartwell brought it to the breakfast room, where Ella and Sebastian sat reviewing the week's planting schedule, their chairs positioned closer together than propriety strictly required. Sebastian broke the seal, his expression shifting from curiosity to cold fury as he read. Without a word, he passed the document to Ella. By order of Nicholas Burton, Esquire, we hereby contest the validity of the marriage contracted between Miss Ella Burton and Sebastian Garner, Duke of Ravenwood, on the grounds of non-consummation. Mr. Burton demands the immediate return of his daughter and restitution of damages in the amount of £30,000. Ella's hands trembled, 3 times what Sebastian had paid for her. "He's heard about the orchards," she said quietly, "about the estate's recovery. Your father's debts have apparently multiplied. He sees you as an asset to be liquidated at higher market value." Sebastian's voice was ice. "But he is correct about one thing. The marriage has not been consummated. That provides grounds for annulment." The words hung between them, sharp as broken glass. They had grown close in the past weeks, but the physical boundary remained unbreached. "So he can simply reclaim me?" "He can try." Sebastian stood, pacing to the window. "His lawyer is undoubtedly preparing documents. He will argue you were coerced, that the marriage was never properly sealed." A knock at the door. Mrs. Hartwell entered, her expression troubled. "Your Graces, there is a Mr. Cornelius Webb in the drawing-room, representing Mr. Nicholas Burton." Sebastian's hand found Ella's, squeezing once. "Send him to the library." Mr. Webb was everything Ella expected: expensive suit, calculating eyes, the smug expression of a man who believes the law is on his side. He stood when they entered, executing a bow that contained no respect. "Your Grace, Miss Burton." "Duchess Ravenwood," Sebastian corrected sharply. "Ah, yes, about that." Webb produced papers from his case. "Mr. Burton has filed for annulment on grounds of non-consummation. The marriage has not been formalized in the manner required by law." "My marriage is entirely legal," Sebastian said coldly. "Legal, perhaps, but valid." Webb's smile was practiced, predatory. "Mr. Burton is prepared to pursue this through ecclesiastical court unless certain conditions are met. The return of Miss Burton to her father's household, along with £30,000 compensation." "To buy back the daughter he sold to me for 10?" Sebastian said flatly. "Mr. Burton's circumstances have evolved. Unless you are prepared to testify under oath that the marriage has been consummated, that would settle the matter immediately." The silence stretched like a wound. To lie under oath would be perjury. To tell the truth would give Nicholas Burton exactly what he wanted. "I see," Webb said softly. "Mr. Burton has already filed with the ecclesiastical court. You will both be summoned for testimony within the fortnight. And, Miss Burton, your father has arranged a more suitable match. Lord Ashford is elderly and in need of a nurse, not a wife." Sebastian's entire body went rigid. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "You will leave my house now, and tell Nicholas Burton that if he wishes to contest this marriage, he may do so in court, where I will ensure every debt, every deception, every instance of his negligence becomes public record." Webb gathered his papers, unruffled. "The court date is set for the 15th of next month. I trust you will use the time wisely." After he left, Ella and Sebastian stood in the library, the weight of the threat settling over them. "He will win," Ella said finally, "unless we can prove the marriage is valid." Sebastian turned to face her, his expression torn. "I will not force you into my bed to satisfy a legal technicality. And if I choose it willingly," she stepped closer,
We have built something here, Sebastian, something worth fighting for. I will not let my father destroy it because of some arbitrary measure of validity. He kissed her before she could finish, pulling her against him with weeks of restraint finally breaking. I want, he said roughly against her mouth, God help me, I want everything.
The alliance formed with surgical precision. 3 days after Webb's visit, Richard Garner appeared at Ravenwood's gates with his siblings in tow, their carriages bearing trunks that suggested an extended stay. Sebastian received them in the drawing-room with Ella at his side, her hand resting possessively on his arm. "Cousin," Richard said, his smile sharp as broken glass, "we heard about your legal troubles. Families should stand together in times of crisis." "How thoughtful," Sebastian replied, "though I'm uncertain what crisis you refer to. Come now, Sebastian, the entire county knows Nicholas Burton is contesting your marriage. Such a scandal." Catherine settled onto the sofa with practiced elegance. "We've come to offer our support, and perhaps our testimony, should the court require character witnesses." The threat was delicate, wrapped in concern. Ella felt Sebastian's arm tense beneath her fingers. "Character witnesses," Ella said carefully. "To attest to what, precisely?" Edmund leaned against the mantelpiece, his posture deliberately casual. "To the Duke's state of mind when he contracted this hasty marriage, his grief over our dear departed cousins, his isolation, his instability." "I am not unstable," Sebastian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Of course not," Richard soothed, "but grief can make a man vulnerable to manipulation. A young woman of limited prospects suddenly elevated to Duchess through a midnight ceremony with no witnesses. Some might question her motives." Ella's spine straightened. "My motives were made abundantly clear in our marriage contract, which, I assure you, is legally binding." "Legally binding, perhaps, but morally questionable." Catherine's eyes glittered with malice. "A marriage predicated on barrenness, on the explicit promise of no heirs. What respectable court wouldn't see that as a dereliction of ducal duty?" The strategy crystallized before Ella's eyes. Nicholas Burton would argue the marriage was invalid through non-consummation. The cousins would argue it was invalid through improper purpose, a deliberate attempt to circumvent the natural succession. Together, they would paint Sebastian as mentally unfit and Ella as an opportunistic schemer. "I see," Sebastian said, "and I suppose you've already shared these concerns with Mr. Burton's lawyer." "We may have corresponded," Edmund admitted. "Mr. Webb seemed quite interested in our perspective on family matters." "How convenient. And what do you gain from this correspondence?" Edmund pushed off the mantelpiece. "Sebastian, be reasonable. This marriage is a farce, an insult to the legacy of Garner. If it's annulled, you're free to marry properly, to secure an heir and protect the line. Or, Catherine added sweetly, if the court finds you incompetent to manage your affairs, Richard, as the eldest male cousin, could petition for guardianship, for your own protection, naturally." The final piece fell into place. They didn't simply want Ella gone, they wanted Sebastian declared unfit, his estate placed under Richard's control. It was a coup dressed as concern. "You've miscalculated," Ella said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Badly." Richard's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon?" "You assume we have no defense, that we'll simply accept your version of events." She moved to Sebastian's desk, withdrawing the leather journal he had shown her weeks ago. "My husband has documented every suspicious incident at Ravenwood for the past 4 years, every near miss, every accident, every convenient death, including the systematic poisoning of the Ravenwood gardens." The color drained from Edmund's face. "We have soil samples, purchase records for arsenic compounds, testimony from the groundskeeper about who had access to the affected areas, and financial records showing how the 3 of you would profit from Ravenwood's decline." "You have nothing," Richard said, but his voice lost its certainty. "We have enough to make your lives very uncomfortable in open court." Sebastian stood, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "So here is my counteroffer. You withdraw your support from Nicholas Burton's suit. You leave Ravenwood immediately and do not return, and in exchange I will not pursue criminal charges for attempted murder and destruction of property. You wouldn't dare, Catherine breathed. Try me. Sebastian's smile was cold as winter. I have already lost 2 brothers to your schemes. I will not lose my wife. The silence stretched taut like a wire. Richard's jaw worked, calculation visible behind his eyes. Finally he stood, smoothing his waistcoat with jerky movements. This is not over, Sebastian. Yes, Sebastian said quietly. It is. You simply haven't accepted it yet. The cousins departed within the hour, their carriages rattling down the drive like retreating soldiers. Ella and Sebastian watched from the library window as the last of them disappeared into the forest. They'll regroup, Ella said. Find another angle. Let them try. Sebastian pulled her against him, his arms solid and certain around her waist. They're not fighting a reclusive duke anymore. They're fighting a partnership. Ella leaned into his warmth, watching the light fade over the recovering gardens. Then God help them, she murmured, because we've already survived worse than they can imagine.
The ecclesiastical courtroom smelled of old wood and older judgment. Ella stood before the panel of 3 justices, her spine straight, her dove-grey dress chosen deliberately to suggest neither mourning nor celebration. Sebastian sat in the gallery behind her, his presence a steady anchor. Across the aisle, Nicholas Burton sat with his lawyer, flanked by the Garner cousins who had conveniently appeared as concerned family. The Chief Justice, Lord Pemberton, no relation to the solicitor who had married them, adjusted his spectacles. We are here to consider the petition of Nicholas Burton regarding the annulment of marriage between his daughter and the Duke of Ravenwood on grounds of non-consummation and improper consent. Mr. Webb rose, his performance polished. Your lordships, the facts are simple. Miss Burton was sold, and I use that word deliberately, to the Duke of Ravenwood in a transaction that more closely resembled property transfer than holy matrimony. No banns were read, no family attended. The ceremony occurred at midnight in a private library, and crucially, the marriage has not been consummated, rendering it invalid under both ecclesiastical and common law. Nicholas Burton took the stand, playing the concerned father with theatrical precision. I believed I was securing my daughter's future. I had no idea the Duke intended to keep her as some sort of ornamental companion rather than a proper wife. When I learned of the true nature of their arrangement, my conscience demanded I act. Your conscience, Ella said quietly, rising without permission, or your creditors. The courtroom stirred. Lord Pemberton frowned. The respondent will wait to be called. Forgive me, your lordship, but I have evidence that cannot wait. Ella approached the bench, placing a leather portfolio before the justices. These are my father's financial records, obtained legally from his bank. They show debts totaling £47,000, with payments due within the month. They also show that immediately after filing this petition, my father negotiated a marriage contract with Lord Ashford, a man of 83 years who requires a nurse, not a wife, for a sum of £35,000. Mr. Burton's face went crimson. How dare you? I dare because I am not your property, father. I am the Duchess of Ravenwood, and this court will hear the truth. She turned to the justices. My father did not sell me to secure my future. He sold me to settle his gambling debts. When the Duke proved more solvent than expected, when Ravenwood began to prosper again, my value increased. So he seeks to reclaim me, not out of paternal concern, but for profit. Lord Pemberton examined the documents, his expression darkening. Mr. Burton, these records appear authentic. Can you explain this contract with Lord Ashford? A precaution, nothing more. A precaution dated 3 days after you filed for annulment, another justice interjected, suggesting premeditation. Ella pressed forward.
And there is more, your lordships. The Duke's cousins who sit in support of my father's petition have their own agenda. She produced Sebastian's journal, along with Thomas Blackwood's sworn testimony and soil analysis. For 3 years they have systematically poisoned the Ravenwood estate, murdered the Duke's brothers, and attempted to kill the Duke himself. They sought to drive him to financial ruin, forcing the sale of the estate they would then purchase at reduced value. Richard Garner shot to his feet. "This is preposterous." "This is documented evidence," Ella cut him off. "Soil samples containing arsenic and copper sulfate, purchase records from London chemists, testimony from the groundskeeper and estate workers, and financial records showing all 3 cousins invested heavily in agricultural property adjacent to Ravenwood, property that would triple in value if Ravenwood failed and its lands were partitioned." She turned to face the gallery, her voice ringing clear. "My father and the Duke's cousins have formed an alliance of greed. They seek to invalidate my marriage not because it is improper, but because it threatens their schemes. A childless Duchess protects the Duke from assassination while ensuring his estate passes to charitable trust rather than his murderous relations." "And the matter of consummation?" Lord Pemberton asked quietly. Ella met his gaze without flinching. "The marriage has been consummated, your lordship, repeatedly and enthusiastically. I can provide testimony from the household staff if required, though I would prefer to spare us all the indignity." A ghost of a smile crossed the justice's face. "That will not be necessary, your grace." Sebastian stood, moving to Ella's side. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining before the entire court. "My wife speaks truth," he said. "Our marriage began as a transaction, yes, but it has become something far greater. She has saved my estate, exposed my enemies, and given me reason to believe in futures I thought lost." His voice softened. "She is the finest thing that has ever happened to Ravenwood, and to me." The Chief Justice conferred with his colleagues in whispered tones. Finally, he looked up. "This court finds no grounds for annulment. The marriage between Sebastian Garner, Duke of Ravenwood, and Ella Garner, Duchess of Ravenwood, is valid and binding. Furthermore, we recommend investigation into the allegations of poisoning and fraud." His gaze hardened on Nicholas Burton and the cousins. "This court is adjourned." Ella's knees nearly buckled with relief. Sebastian caught her, pulling her close, as the courtroom erupted in whispers. Across the aisle, Nicholas Burton sat frozen, his face ashen. The cousins were already moving toward the exits, their schemes crumbling around them. "Well fought, your grace," Sebastian murmured against her hair. Ella looked up at him, at the man who had bought her as a shield and received a partner instead. Well fought, husband. They walked from the courthouse together, hand in hand, leaving behind the father who had sold her and the cousins who had tried to destroy them. The gardens of Ravenwood awaited, healed, blooming, ready for the future they would build together. Not despite their brokenness, but because of what they had made from it. My lovely family, Ella's journey ends here, but perhaps yours is just beginning. You've witnessed a woman transform from a name crossed out in a ledger into a duchess who rewrote the very definition of legacy. If her story stirred something in you, if you recognized yourself in her refusal to be diminished, or in Sebastian's journey from isolation to love, then I invite you to keep this story alive. Like this tale, share it with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't measured by what they can't give, but by who they choose to become. Subscribe, because stories like Ella's, about women who defy biology's limitations, families forged by choice rather than blood, and finding power in a world designed to make you feel powerless, deserve to be told again and again.
These narratives matter because someone out there needs to know that being different from expectation isn't a curse, it's often the beginning of something extraordinary. Leave a comment telling me what moved you most. Was it Ella's courtroom triumph, her botanical brilliance that saved poisoned ground, the way a loveless transaction became genuine partnership? Your words don't just inspire me, they light the path for others seeking stories that reflect their own hidden struggles and quiet victories. At the end of this tale, another soul awaits, another character fighting to claim their place, their voice, their future. Click through and discover what happens when courage meets circumstance in the most unexpected ways. Thank you for being here, for choosing stories that matter, for believing that broken things can still bloom. With deepest gratitude and affection, the Victorian Romance Tales team.